is getting a little bit warmer. It's not what you think it is. The thing that you hear in the media isn't really necessarily the way that it is. And that's kind of unfortunate. A lot of the information's fragmented, and really if you get the bigger picture, it's not so hard to understand. But the water quality and quantity issues just aren't local, but they're global as well. Oftentimes when we're expanding our infrastructure, we do it to meet the needs of the completion of the product or project instead of to meet the needs of the future. And the problem with that is that the population is actually predictable as far as what the expansion is going to be in a certain area. But it's really unfortunate, again, that our politicians don't really like to do products that aren't, or projects that aren't visible readily. And they just, in this case, they hope that we won't have a drought, and then when we do, it's kind of everybody scrambling to make do with the situation at hand. Let's talk about water. Where does it come from? A big misconception is that we're running out of water. We're really not. 97% of the world's water lies in the oceans. It's in salt water. 2% is in glacier ice. 1% is in fresh water that's available for us to use. And that fresh water that's available is, it's surface water. It's in our rivers and creeks. It's in our aquifers, those types of things. We use water for everything. It's not just for our outdoor use, our personal outdoor use, but it's really used in every part of our environment, especially our personal use, for washing our clothes, to our cars, and it's a basic function of mammal biology. We've got to have it. The Financial Times in London reported that 80% of all diseases in 33 countries were caused by inadequate water supplies. The other bigger problem is 2% of the 2 million tons of excrement waste produced daily in citizens of the world is treated. The other 98% is not, and is discharged into our freshwater supplies, which is, that's a pretty big issue as well. It's not so hard to treat fresh water. It's actually cheap. It's inexpensive. The bigger problem is you can't treat that 98% in salt water. You can do it, but it's not yet economically feasible. It's outside our reach, but that's where most of the water is. The infrastructure, again, is part of that problem. The infrastructure that we have currently was developed, in the 20s and 30s when the population was a lot smaller. They decided at that point in time to build lakes. There's only one natural lake in Texas. The rest of them were man-made, and they were made to store water. And they used our rivers and streams as a transportation device instead of pipelines, which was all well and good back then, and it met the needs. But as populations advanced, or increased, they didn't change that, and they still really haven't done that yet. But there's a lot of different reasons for the various degrees of water shortage that we find. Part of it is insufficient rainfall, but a bigger issue is the treatment delivery capacity and the pipe structure, and every part of it's all antiquated, and it needs to be replaced. The other issue that we find at hand is that a lot of people they use our infrastructure, they use fresh water as a way to limit population growth, or at least that's what they think they're trying to do. And then especially here in Austin, there's a new lawsuit filed the other day by SOS against the treatment facility out at 620 and 2222 with using the salamander, again, as the reason that they shouldn't build it. 2 years into the project, they're suing to stop it. And, unfortunately, they have sued every time they've tried to build a new pipeline. Fortunately, this time, when they developed the pipeline and put the plans into place, they expected the lawsuit. And so the plans included plans to not harm the salamanders this time. So the lawsuit should turn out to be frivolous, and it shouldn't really go anywhere. Another point is that, because our infrastructure is so antiquated, we lose 10 to 15% of our fresh water to leaks. It's just unaccounted for. They don't really know where it goes to. It's just seepage into the ground. The perception versus the reality. There's a big problem, and when we talk about water conservation, really what are we talking about? With public consumption using really the least amount of water that's out there, and industrial and agriculture using the most. and I'll get into the amount in a minute. The amount that the public uses is really just it's a drop in the bucket, and the long-term effects of that are huge. When we start taking plants out of the environment, what's going to happen is it's going to decrease rainfall, and I'll show you why and how in a second. You know, everybody, or really nobody really thinks about where rainfall comes from, but it's really simple. It comes from evaporation. When we remove plants from the landscape, what happens? You remove evaporative sources. And the problem is when we replace those plants, what are we replacing them with? Concrete, steel, housing, asphalt, those types of things that are not evaporative sources. And actually they're creating heat sink. They absorb radiant heat during the day and they discharge it at night. So with that in mind, you can see really simply why we're losing rainfall, or why the rainfall is decreasing, and why things are warming up a little bit. You know, they talk about glacier ice and all that kind of stuff. Well, they've cored down back, a million years, and they can tell that glacier ice has always shrunk and enlarged through the years. I'm not that concerned about that. That's just the way it is. To say it's shrunk over a period of time in the last 10 years, I think that's ridiculous. If you look back in the early 90s, they talked about global cooling. I think everybody here probably remembers that. Now we're talking about global warming. The fact is the temperatures do fluctuate, and that happens, okay? But this other issue with rainfall, that's a whole different thing, and that's going to exacerbate the situation. The evapotranspiration or the evaporation from plants and the soil surface back up into the air has a cooling effect. Okay, if you look here at the UT campus, there are air conditioners. They're the old swamp coolers that run water through them, and that's how they cool the buildings. It's the same principle. The other thing is when it rains, it cools. When it rains, it cleans our air. With the plants that we have in our environment, they clean our air. And unfortunately, when we get into these drought situations, the first thing that they want to do is cut back on plants, and they want to encourage us to use low water use plants, or they encourage the use of xeriscape plants. Xeriscape is not something that you hear about much anymore, and there's a reason for that. Many colleges did studies on xeriscapes to see what the actual water savings was, and they found that xeriscape landscapes actually used more water. Why was that? And the explanation is really simple. It's because of people. When you take a natural plant, most natural plants just aren't that aesthetically pleasing to look at. And so the tendency for human nature is to put more water on it to make it look better. Or in another case, they'll take it and they'll put aggregate around those plants. They'll put decomposed granite around, which again absorbs radiant heat, and it increases the need for the plant to take more water in. And so they found that, guess what? They use a little bit more water, which is, it was crazy. When I first heard that, it was in a Master Gardener course when I first got certified. And it was a Texas A&M professor. And I was like, really? I had no idea. Unlike other natural resources that are consumable, like oil, coal, lumber, those types of things, water's not consumed. The water that we have here right now is the same amount of water that we had on this planet 1 billion years ago. It's just stored in different ways. Unlike coal, again, when you burn coal, whatever, it's just gone. Water is stored in different vessels and forms. It's stored in a liquid state, in a gas, you can freeze it. But when I talk about vessels, I'm talking about glaciers, oceans, rivers, lakes, pipes, bottles, can of Coke, everything's got water in it in some way, some form. Including people, plants, and animals. When we die and we are put in the ground, the humidity comes out of our body. That water is still there. So it's ready, it'll hopefully get turned back into humidity, go back up into the sky and rain back down on us again. But there's a problem with that again, and it's in how we manage that water that we have right now. But the amount of water we have on the earth is 290 million cubic miles of water. And that doesn't mean anything to anybody because nobody knows what a cubic mile of water is. It's 17.4 million gallons. And that's been constant back for 1 billion years. It does, for it to leave the Earth, it'd have to go into outer space. It's just, you know, and that's not happening. Yeah. But anyway, let's talk for a minute about the hydrologic cycle. The hydrologic cycle is something that we all learned about in grade school, but we probably forgot. And what the hydrologic cycle is, it's basically how the water comes from the ground into the plant root structure, evaporates through the plants, goes up into the sky, water vapor forms, and then comes back down to us again. Generally, the amount of rainfall the amount of water that comes up in the air is the amount that comes right back down again, okay? If you don't have evaporation, you're not gonna have rainfall. There's a 30% net gain every year of fresh water that falls on dry land. That water comes from evaporation off our oceans. So because most of the world is ocean, when water evaporates up into the sky off the oceans, it's clean, fresh water. 30% more than we have now on dry land falls back on our dry land again. So 30% net gain every year. Well, what happens to that? Well, a lot of different things happens to the water that falls back on dry land, but unfortunately, most of it leaves us again because of our management practices. And hopefully what I'm going to try to do today is let y'all know how we do it and give you an idea on how we should do it. But the hydrologic cycles, it's not very complicated at all. So when rainfall falls, it's going to either hit the ground and be pulled down through gravitational pull. Some of it's going to be taken up by the roots of plants again and evaporate back up again. And plants just use water basically to transport nutrients in the plant. That's what it uses it for. It'll transport nutrients from the roots up to the foliage through photosynthesis. It takes that, and it turns it into simple sugars and starches, and again, it transports it down again, and then you've got evaporation from the foliage. And when the water evaporates off, that's actually what causes that negative pull to pull the water up through to the top, okay? And then you have runoff, of course. And runoff takes place when there's nothing to stop that water and hold it. And one of the best things that we have to control runoff is grasses of some sort, okay? Without grasses, you know, it's just going to keep running, especially in a heavy clay, rocky soil like what we have around here. Cities tend to, they take the runoff and they put it in the storm sewers, and where do they take it? They take it right into the Colorado River again. And what happens to that water? Well, it goes downstream, and where does it eventually end up in? Back in salt water where it evaporated from. Wouldn't it make more sense to hold it in place and just use it over and over again? Recapture that water and clean it, since it's really kind of cheap to do that. It's kind of a crazy reality. We're never going to exhaust our water supply that we have here on our planet. What we've got to do is just manage it better. And the water management practices that we have by our city and state really is what causes the shortages. Now, really, how wise was it for engineer system? You know, back in the day, it made sense. You know, again, we only have one natural lake in Texas. Does anybody even know what that is? That's right, it's Caddo Lake. It's the only natural lake in Texas. Every other lake was built for the management of water. Lake Travis is an industrial lake. Most people don't want to hear that because they built their houses around it and stuff. It was meant to fluctuate, to provide water primarily for the rice farmers below San Antonio. You know, and how much sense does that make? You know, to supply, you know, for rice farmers to be down there, they ought to be around Houston. A lot of them are. Why are they down below San Antonio? They actually use the most water. They use more water than the city of Austin and San Antonio put together. And that's a little bit on the ridiculous side. And there's the question also, what kind of water should we be conserving? Fresh water, salt water, effluent water? You know, the effluent water can be recycled quite well again. Lakeway uses it back in their medians and their golf courses. I remember the day after I found that out, I was actually driving through Lakeway, enjoying the water spraying on my face in a convertible, and I was like, and the guy sitting next to me, he's like, you know, I was like, really? What's the problem? You know, and he explained that it was partially treated effluent. I was like, oh, had no idea. But there's ups and downs of that, but it's a pretty cheap way to do it. But we don't do that. And there's actually a reason why. And it's because of again, back to our management system with the LCRA, and then there's the Upper Colorado River Authorities. There's all these different management systems. And what they do is they sell water to like the city of Austin, and then the city of Austin treats it and they distribute it. And then the other side of that is that the city of Austin gets a rebate for putting it back in to the Colorado River again. You can see that problem. First of all, outdoor water use is lost water. They don't get that rebate back. So it doesn't make economic sense for the city to encourage outdoor water use. The second thing is also if you use a fluent again to irrigate with or whatever, even if it's a golf course or some other high water use property, again, it doesn't make economic sense for the city to allow that. You know, if we just took rediverted the water off of our showers, for instance, how long does it take you for your shower to heat up in the morning? You know, 3 or 4 minutes. How much water are you losing? You know, they push these low volume toilets on us that you have to flush 3 times. That'll save you 20 gallons over a week. Well, if you diverted the water off your shower there and recaptured that, you'd save several thousand gallons a week. The other side of that is there's a device that's like $125. Actually, first time I found it was at Sam's. What it does is it attaches to your hot water heater and it pressurizes your hot water pipe. And then at the farthest point of your house at your sink, you put a manifold in that crosses between the hot and cold water pipe. And what it does is it allows the water to run in a circle. You don't lose it. So that at that little manifold, it's got a thermostat in there that opens up and closes. It's completely mechanical. And so your water is always instantly hot in the bathroom. Found it at Costco, I think it was. You know, why don't you hear about those things? You know, it's kind of crazy. Anyway, to add to the confusion, whenever they talk about water, they use these acronyms that nobody really knows what they mean. 1,000,000 gallons per day, acre foot, gallons per capita per day, and 100 cubic feet. That last one's one we see all the time. You know, the way that we manage the water, a lot of it has to do with who owns it, and that's changed. The definition of the ownership of water has changed. Used to be that if it ran underneath your property and you could pump it, or it ran on top or through your property, you owned it. You could dam it up. But you can't do that anymore. Now it's all about, if you take it out, put back as much as you can to give it to the guys downstream. Mark Twain said whiskey was for drinking, water was for fighting. You know, really he was way ahead of his time. He didn't really have a clue what it was all going to turn into. We already talked about that, didn't we? Who consumes the most water? That kind of depends on the definition of that. I said earlier the consumers actually use the least. They use 8% of the total water. Okay, the rest goes to industry and agriculture. Of treated water, which is the next question, or the next part of that, because they're different. You've got treated water and untreated water. Of treated water, consumers use about 60% of that. Okay, but the problem when you get into a conservation thing like what we are in now, it's about the total volume of water that's available. So the amount of water that's available in Lake Travis, for instance, if the volume's not there, you can't really treat it. And the other part of that goes back to the delivery systems that we use to distribute it. We can treat it just fine. We just can't distribute it right now because the pipelines don't exist. It seems like on a 10-year cycle, every 10 years, you're hearing about a pipeline that can't be built because of some reason. It's usually an environmental group saying you can't build that. But really what it comes down to is that they don't want to see the property developed. And so, again, what they're trying to do is limit development by limiting the access to underground or infrastructure. And I get it, but the reality is, too, we need to provide that infrastructure really before we build any houses. Another part of that is that as we build houses, you know, the size of the lots have gotten smaller, okay? When the size of the lots, you know, if you go back to the 80s and 90s, the lots were really pretty decent sizes. The houses were larger now. If you know, when you go out to the suburbs in Blockhouse Creek or, In Cedar Park, the size of the lots are a whole lot smaller. Average is probably around 3,000 square foot of turf, where they used to be 45 to 5. Problem with that is that retail follows development. When you reduce the size of lots, you increase the number of people per square mile, which actually increases the water usage, because they're washing clothes, taking baths, you know, the showers, just everything that goes along with it. And the amount of turf, trees, and landscape that they're putting in the lawns is smaller. It's shrunk. And then you've got the retail business that support those, the restaurants and things like that. So the water usage and recovery, water usage has gone through the roof per square mile, and the recovery from evaporation is just tremendously fallen. So, you know, it's really kind of a huge problem. These are some interesting factoids that I found from the American Water Works Association. And it's just a trade association for the people that clean water and distribute it. 10% of the homes are responsible for 58% of the leaks, which is really, you know, homes with pools are 55% more likely to have a leak. Leakage is less likely at homes with drip irrigation or people that hand water. And again, I think that's a plumbing issue. They don't have the additional plumbing. Because outdoor water use is more discretionary than indoor use, outdoor use will decline as prices rise. And that's not something that Austin's done here. We just say, you know, everybody's water's the same price. It doesn't matter if you buy 1 gallon or 10,000 gallons, it's all the same. That's something I'd personally like to see, is for an escalating water bill. Is you can use as much as you want if you can pay for it. You know, I think that there ought to be a reasonable amount that everybody starts with, but if you're Michael Dell and you're irrigating 10 acres or whatever, well, hell yeah, you ought to pay a whole lot more, I think. Homes with drip irrigation use 15% more water than those without. Households that hand water use 33% less. Households with gardens use 30% more. And then back to our amazing findings that xeriscapes actually use more. They came back with that as well. So what is an inch of water? Go ahead.
I was curious about the previous one where you say that homes with in-ground irrigation systems use 35% more water than those without. What is the explanation for that one?
It's easier to water. It's easier to water, that's why. And if you have a timer on it, you even use more because you don't have to flip a switch. Most people that have irrigation systems now, especially in Texas, actually have a time. They're automatic and they have a timer. Other parts of the country, they don't have timers. They have to actually go out and they just turn them on. But in Texas, we generally have timers. It's the human involvement. You know, and that goes back to the human involvement creates most landscape problems. In the lawn care business, in most plant care business, what these people are doing is they're correcting irrigation problems with chemicals. Generally, fungal problems come around when they're overwatered. Insect problems come around when they're underwatered. It's really just as simple as that, but nobody really wants to talk about that. So what is an inch of water? Now think about that. It's 624 gallons over 1,000 square feet, or 27,000 gallons on an acre. So when we get rainfall of an inch of water, or an inch of rainfall, think about how much that is over the city of Austin. It's millions of gallons of water. You know, it's a lot. And so when in the summertime, our lawns generally need about 1.75 inches of water per thousand square feet over the lawn, okay? A tree uses about 10 gallons per diameter inch of tree trunk per week, okay? And the difficulty in irrigating trees is, where do you do that at? If it's a newly planted tree, it's pretty easy to do because you're gonna do it to the outskirts of the root ball. Roots always go towards the higher level of moisture. They grow to the higher level of moisture. So I'm sure you've heard people say, oh, my roots from my tree grew into my sewer system, or the roots from my tree grew into my pool. It caused a crack. It's actually not like that. The crack happened first and the tree roots grew to it. They sensed the moisture and they grew towards it. That's why when you water less frequently, the root systems tend to elongate. If the water supply is met frequently, there's no reason for the roots to elongate. because they're not trying to seek it at that point. Everybody with me so far? Not boring you, right? The environmental benefits of a landscape, we don't have to guess what they are because we know what they are. We don't have to assume anything. China already did it. They did it back in the 60s. They took out their lawns and landscapes. They did it for a different reason. They did it because it provided the population with a semblance of Western culture, and they didn't like that. So they took out their lawns and landscapes and all that kind of goodness, and their temperatures in their cities went up 10 to 30 degrees. It was crazy. So of course the smog and dust increased because without humidity, there's nothing to bind with the dust particles to make them fall. Without rainfall, again, the dust didn't fall. Human disease increased because viruses and bacteria, they attach really well to those dust particles that blow through the air. The water quality and quantity decreased in the rivers and lakes and streams, again, because they're discharging effluent into the freshwater supply. And when there's less of it, there's a higher concentration. And lastly, rainfall decreased. Today, they started back in the early 90s, actually brought in Texas A&M to help them fix the problems that they caused on themselves. China actually has now more lakes per square mile than any other country out there. They fixed the problems. They still have a lot of problems and they still have a ways to go, but it's not quite done yet. Australia did, they tried some things as well. They were trying to plant trees around their reservoirs and things like that. Wind blocks, a lot of reasons stop the erosion. Again, trees seek out higher levels of moisture. What did that do? Well, it caused them to drain the reservoirs. That's what it did. And so what they ended up doing was taking the trees out and planting prairie grasses instead. In southern United States, Arizona, Phoenix, those places, if you remember back 10 years ago, wildfires everywhere. The only houses that survived were houses that had a landscape that they took care of. Again, it provided a natural natural fire break. A green plant is less likely to burn than a dry, dead plant. And that's going to be a problem that we run into here in Austin, especially with the hillsides that we have out in the Westlake area. You're going to find as the droughts increase and as the rainfall subsides a bit, you're going to find it's going to happen any day, I can tell you that. When a fire starts, it's going to burn it's going to be bad. And I'm not talking, bass drop's a drop in the bucket. When it happens in our hilly areas over here, it's going to be a whole lot worse. I was in Bass Drop. I've seen what happened out there, and most of that was across flat land. The homeowners in Phoenix fixed their own problem. They all revolted, and the city councils, they actually put in the reservoirs now to fix the problems. Again, residential homes use 8% of the total fresh water or 60% of the total treated water. Codes require new development to satisfy the needs of both residential and future commercial development. We talked about that again, in that the more residential properties you have in an area, the higher population, the more commercial development that's going to happen at the same time.